Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined once again by the great Nathan Jahnke. Nate, much better round of playoff games this past weekend than the wild card round, I'd say. So, how are you doing? Did you enjoy the past weekend worth of games?
I did. I enjoyed the weekend. I enjoyed college on Monday, and now it's sad knowing we just have 2 days of football left. Hopefully, they should all be good games, though. Very much looking forward to the conference championship games.
Yeah, I think that'll be good. It'll be fun to see, an NFC East conference championship over there, and then Chiefs are back at it again, and we'll see if the Bills can finally dethrone them. But yeah, should be really interesting. It'll be fun games to watch. But yeah, today we're talking fantasy as usual. We're continuing our early 2025 positional ranking series here. We covered the running back position last week, so make sure to check that one out if you haven't already. And now we're on to the quarterback position, where we're going to cover the top 12 or so at the position. Nate, you've put this together in article form on pff.com with the full list of QB tiers and rankings, with some rationale in there as well. And it's free for people to check out now if they'd like. But we're going to go into some detail about the top names on that list as things stand right now. So what do you say we get into it here?
Yeah, let's get into it. Some unsurprising names at the top, but we will still go through the top list.
Naturally, we'll start right at the top here with the tier one and two quarterbacks who led the position in fantasy scoring, at least for weeks 1 to 17 in 2024. The two top MVP candidates for the NFL this season, and two quarterbacks who faced off in the divisional round this past weekend. It's Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills at 1 and Lamar Jackson at 2. So we'll start with Allen, Nate, and what kind of gives him maybe the edge over Lamar for you. But first, I guess, what was it about these two quarterbacks for you that separated them from the rest of the pack?
In general, we've seen the past couple of years the Russian quarterbacks kind of take over the league. We definitely see that with the teams that are in the conference championship game, and that's also been true in fantasy. We've seen consistently the top quarterbacks in fantasy points the past couple seasons have been the quarterbacks who are doing a lot in the run game, and Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson both get a lot of their value in the run game, and they're also two of the better passers in the league. So when you have that combination of being able to run and pass, that leads to some elite production that we've kind of consistently seen them year over year be among the top quarterbacks. ESPN does a great article that I like each year, looking at the percentage of teams that draft a player that make the fantasy playoffs. And the last 2 years, we've seen it be Josh Allen be one of the top ones. Lamar Jackson was the top one this year. So it's paid off to not wait at quarterback and pick one of these guys that we just know will consistently do well as long as they don't get injured. So I think that's going to drive up the prices of quarterbacks this year too, of like, once you get to wide receiver 10, yeah, they could be wide receiver 10. They could be wide receiver 20. There could be a lot of guys in that mix, but there's only a couple quarterbacks that are going to be at the top of the quarterback list.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think for Allen too, like specifically at number one here, just, one of the things we talked about last offseason with why we had Josh Allen as QB1 was not just like the elite rushing ability, but like how his fantasy production is less dependent on those around him than almost any other quarterback in the league, right? Because there were concerns that, without Stephon Diggs and even to an extent Gabe Davis, that he wouldn't have that kind of receiving core to maybe elevate him to the elite fantasy production. But because of his rushing success, it was pretty clear that he could still have elite success without them, and he did. He scored the second highest fantasy points from rushing, behind only Jalen Hurts, in large part thanks to 12 rushing touchdowns, 7 of which came from inside the 5, also second behind Jalen Hurts, and that tush push where Jalen Hurts had like 11 inside the 5 or something like that. But yeah, he's also like one of the best passing quarterbacks in the league. He led the league in big time throw rate at 7%, thanks to that monster arm. And then you just add in the elite rushing ability to that. I'm with you. I'd have no problem with him as QB1 once again.
Yeah, and like for me, it's the consistency with Allen. Like Allen's worst season over the past 5 years is better than everyone else's average season in terms of fantasy points. That's how consistent he's been. And I do like that he has this young core of receivers. I know he's less dependent on his receivers, but ideally they're going to get even better. Khalil Shakir had a good year. Dalton Kincaid, even though he hasn't put up the fantasy production we'd like, he's still doing a good job when he is given opportunities. And Keon Coleman also should improve in his second year. So part of it for me having Allen above Jackson is that young group of receivers that ideally will improve, which could help Allen get even better than what we've seen.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't hurt to have an elite supporting cast for sure. So there is obviously one player who will make a push for that QB1 claim as well. Lamar Jackson, Nate, coming off a career year in terms of passing grade, overall grade, big time throw rate, turnover worthy play rate, passing touchdowns, and he led the position in rushing yards. So Lamar is showing no signs of slowing down at this point. He's QB2 for you right now, but just like how close is he to QB1 for you, I guess? And do you think you're willing to, would you change it up and go Lamar QB1 at time in drafts, or is it Josh Allen every time for you?
It'll just depend on where they're getting drafted. Will have a large role in it, and like if you there's only going to be certain draft slots that can get Allen. There's only going to be certain draft slots that get Jackson. So I'm guessing I'll get plenty of both of these quarterbacks, just depending on where I'm drafting and where their ADP ends up falling. With Jackson, the only concerns for me is a lot of the best players around him are past the age where you expect players to peak. Derrick Henry is the oldest running back in the league. He had no signs of slowing down this past year, but he's not going to stay as effective forever. Mark Andrews getting up there for at least tight end age. Still expect him to be a big part of the offense even after that divisional round game. But unfortunate for him, their left tackle, Ronnie Stanley, also beyond age 30, is a free agent this year. So that could potentially hurt if he ends up moving to another team. But just a lot of players around Jackson with the Ravens that I'm a little bit concerned that they could regress a little bit. And even Jackson, he is well past the age where you expect a rushing quarterback to be very effective as a rusher. We've never seen another quarterback like Jackson, so it's hard to know exactly when he will start regressing as a rusher. But he did have one fewer rushing attempt per game this year than we've seen in any other year in his career. So we did see him run less this year. So there is a chance that we might see a slight regression in his rushing, but he still led the league in rushing yards per game this year. So it might not be a significant regression. It's just a lot of little things that could go wrong with Jackson that make me feel more confident with Allen.
That's fair. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you said, even if there's, the slight decrease in rushing, like what I think was really encouraging was, like I said, just taking his passing game to another level this season. Like I said, set kind of career highs in so many key passing categories, which put him right back into that MVP territory for the second straight year. He's definitely going to be drafted as QB1. I think plenty of times this offseason, I'm sure, and rightfully so. I think you can make an argument that, he does have the better supporting cast than Allen right now. Though, like you said, those guys are aging a little bit maybe more dynamic as a runner right now. Arguably a better passer if we're utilizing the grades and other key metrics from this past season. Obviously, a huge year in terms of production there. But yeah, 915 rushing yards, but only 4 rushing touchdowns on the year, which was kind of crazy. He just had one rushing touchdown more than Trevor Lawrence, who played only 10 games and had like 119 rushing yards. So even if we get like some passing regression, maybe a little bit of rushing regression as well, like we could see maybe him find the end zone a bit more as a runner as well. And part of that obviously is they have Derrick Henry in the picture, and Lamar isn't taking carries inside the 5, but I think just kind of considering his rushing ability as a whole, there's probably some positive variance possible there for him. But anyways, all that to say, I'm good with either one of these quarterbacks as QB1. And I agree that they both have the best shot to get there again. So I have a hard time seeing anyone else join them in this tier right now, but we'll see how the offseason goes.
Yeah, with Jackson, like I'd say his opportunity to peak is probably higher. We've seen some of the best fantasy seasons ever out of Jackson. We've just seen other seasons as well where he just hasn't been as good, like still a clear fantasy starter and everything. But when we're nitpicking between two of the best fantasy quarterbacks of all time, having some of the best peaks that we've seen out of quarterbacks ever. So at this point, we're nitpicking, but either one of them you'll be happy with.
Absolutely. All right, so that's tier one. We'll move on to tier two here in just a second. But first, I want to give a shout out to our friends at Fabric by Gerbalife. The new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerbalife is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerbalife was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account can take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and tutors to music classes, and when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, MEET fabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, let's go on to tier two now, Nate. A tier made up of 3 quarterbacks this time. And I'm just realizing that I didn't throw up our slideshow for Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. So we'll give you a quick look at their faces right now. And then we will look at their tier 2 quarterbacks. And this tier is led by the sensational rookie quarterback heading into year 2 of the Washington Commanders, heading to the NFC Championship game as well. The great Jaden Daniels leads this group as QB3 for you, Nate. Obviously, you're feeling pretty optimistic about him heading into the 2025 season. So what's got him as top 3 fantasy quarterback for you right now?
Yeah, I would not be at all surprised if he ends up in tier 1 at some point. We'll see how these games go and then the offseason in general. But rushing, he was right up there with the other elite quarterbacks, finished just behind Jackson in terms of rushing yards per game, was off by just 1 or 2 yards. So was right up there with his rushing. His passing has been great. We've seen his passing grade be pretty excellent. He finished with 22 fantasy points per game, and he had that kind of rough stretch in the middle of the season, but his peaks are just as high as these other quarterbacks. So I think we definitely will see Daniels as a top 5 quarterback just from his rushing ability alone, along with good passing. But I could see him going even higher, being right up there with these top 2 quarterbacks, depending on how this offseason goes. Washington has the 3rd most cap space among any team, so Washington has the opportunity to make some upgrades, particularly at wide receiver. Terry McLaurin's obviously excellent, but beyond that, we've seen Diami Brown have some good games recently. Olamide Zaccheaus had a good stretch of games in some revenge games, so maybe we see him play well in the conference championship in another revenge game. But all of their wide receivers outside of Terry and then Luke McCaffrey, who didn't really do too much in his rookie season. Everyone else is a free agent. So Washington has the opportunity, 1, to bring back any of those wide receivers that they want to keep, but 2, they have the opportunity to add to their wide receiver room this offseason. So I could see them bringing in another player to, could also see them getting a little bit more help on the offensive line, in which case the offense could be even better next season. So if Daniels has more weapons around him, that could lead to an even better season. I know some people might be concerned because we had 2 rookies finish pretty high in fantasy points per game a year ago, and then they didn't have quite as strong of sophomore seasons. But I think that's not necessarily the rule that'll happen every year. I think those were more exceptions where I think Daniels should be able to build on his rookie season. So I'll be very curious to see where ADP ends up with Daniels relative to the other 2 quarterbacks. But I could see it being a case where people just want Daniels because of how good he's did in his rookie year, and we know his ceiling is just as high as those other quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like you said, the expectations right now for Daniels, I think weekly QB1 finishes are not just something we're going to treat as possible, but almost expected of him kind of in year two. And, it's not always easy, like you said, to kind of follow up these elite rookie seasons once NFL teams get, more tape on you, et cetera. We saw that with CJ Stroud, like you alluded to this past season. He was drafted as a top five quarterback the next year, this past offseason, top three in a lot of dynasty ADP, and just couldn't deliver despite the kind of strong supporting cast that he had and a lot in place to succeed. But I think, with the difference with Daniels too, is that he has that elite rushing upside, which CJ Stroud didn't really have, right? Like he's much more dynamic as a runner. He's much more willing to run the ball and put up that production there. Among I think he was third in total rushing production for fantasy this season, behind Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen. So he's right up there, like you said, among the elite. I'm hopeful that they get some additional pieces added to the passing offense to help him a bit more, because yeah, like it feels like, the Diami Browns and Olamide Zacchaeuses and Noah Browns and mid-30s Zach Ertz might not be a sustainable group to rely on, but like you said, they have the cap space to add there. Hopefully they do. But yeah, he was an excellent passer. He limited turnovers. He was an electric runner. So all that combined, it's definitely going to have me drafting him again highly. I'm sure many other people highly as well. So, yeah, it's just obviously the price now is much higher than what it was this past offseason after he put all that together. So going to be a fun player to watch. And yeah, can't wait to see the games this weekend as well with Jayden Daniels, see if he can increase his stock even more. Okay, let's move on to the other names of tier 2 now, Nate. And next up is former tier 1 quarterback from the past few seasons, and the quarterback that Jayden Daniels will face in the NFC Championship round. It's Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. Hurts still a top 5 fantasy QB for you, Nate, but he's no longer part of that top tier right now. So what are you thinking heading into next season here with Hurts?
Yeah, with Hurts, he just wasn't quite as consistent as the other quarterbacks that we talked about. Had stretches of games where he was a top 4 fantasy quarterback in 4 straight games, and other times where he was a top 5 finisher, but then other times where he was outside of the top 12. His PFF grade wasn't quite as high as we would have liked to see, so that was also part of it. But like in terms of rushing, if you look at the past 5 years, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen are just consistently getting at least 550 yards. They have a combined 13 of a possible 15 seasons with 550 yards during that stretch. Only 7 other quarterbacks have a single season with that many rushing yards. So Hurts still has that rushing production. He's still scoring those touchdowns at the 1 yard line consistently, and he still has some of the best weapons in the league at running back, at wide receiver, at tight end. So I think it'll be interesting to see where his ADP ends up. If it's far enough away from these other quarterbacks, Hurts might end up being the best value of the group, because we know his ceiling is right up there. If he just goes back to being a little bit more consistent, his PFF grade goes up a little bit, then Hurts is right up there with the other quarterbacks. But in terms of what you can trust, like Hurts's his floor is much higher than basically any other quarterback we'll talk about because of that rushing production. Like, yeah, there's a chance that they stop doing the tush push at the 1 yard line. Similar concern with Josh Allen. Maybe they stop rushing him at the 1 yard line and they stop scoring so many rushing touchdowns. But even in that case, Hurts is still a clear top 10 fantasy quarterback with his rushing production.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, like you said, the passing, it was down this season. He posted the lowest passing grade this regular season that he had since his rookie season. It was like a 67.0 this year. Only 18 passing touchdowns. Turnover worthy play rate was also the worst it's been since his rookie year. Big time throw rate was the lowest mark of his career. Interestingly, his adjusted completion percentage was 80.1%, was the highest of his career and actually led the league. So I think there's definitely room for a bounce back as a passer, but then you add in, like you said, the high end rushing totals. Mentioned it when we were going over Lamar, but nobody had more rushing touchdowns than Hurts, thanks to him also leading the position in attempts inside the 5 yard line. And also just overall, no quarterback ran the ball more than Hurts. So no quarterback had more fantasy points as a runner than Hurts. And that's, I feel like, unlikely to go away. So keeping him in that top 5 range makes sense for me, even coming off a down year as a passer. The usage is just too good around the goal line, and the ability to bounce back as a passer because of his receiving weapons, and just having a history of showing that ability as a passer before, it's strong. So yeah, top 5, and like you said, could be even a nice bargain if he falls any further than that. All right. Last name in tier 2, someone who did bounce back in 2024 and ended up leading the league in passing yards with 4,918. He led the league in passing touchdowns and PFF passing grade as well. It's Joe Burrow. Nate, your QB5 right now.
Yeah, he ended the season excellent as a passer, consistently getting those 3 touchdowns each game and at least 250 passing yards. So he was very consistent as a passer. In general, the past 2 or 3 seasons, we haven't really seen any quarterback consistently have back-to-back good fantasy seasons that are just pocket passers. And Burrow is the first quarterback that does not get a lot of rushing production that we've talked about so far. And we have seen in previous years, there were quarterbacks that used to be more consistent as passers and could bring up consistent fantasy production. Patrick Mahomes was at that level, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, all guys who weren't getting a lot of rushing production, especially when we're talking about their more recent season when they're in their 30s and 40s, but they were still fantasy starters, at times consistently getting at least 20 fantasy points per game. And Burrow is someone who we've already seen him have 3 seasons where he was scoring at least 20 fantasy points per game. And the times that he wasn't reaching those heights, largely due to injury. So I think Burrow is kind of the exception of a pocket passer that we can depend on. Had one of the best passing grades for a quarterback this year. And even over the past 3 years, his 92.9 passing grade is the clear best for quarterbacks in that time. So I think Burrow being the best passer that we have in the league right now, I think we can trust him. I think the big thing will just be what happens with the wide receivers this offseason. Jamar Chase needs a new contract. Hopefully they bring back T. Higgins, and if not, it'll be interesting to see who they get to replace T. Higgins, and even potentially could have a new third wide receiver on the depth chart. So could see some changes this offseason, and if things go south, then Burrow might end up moving down this list. But assuming things go relatively fine this offseason, I'm comfortable with Burrow being in this tier.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, assuming Jamar Chase is on the team, I mean, they'd be crazy not to give him a contract at this point. But like, as far as like pure passers go, Burrow has to be at the top of the list right now, especially considering everything he was able to do in 2024, coming off wrist surgery, mind you. Like I said, led the league in a lot of passing categories at the top. And if the Bengals had won more games, I mean, he'd probably be in the MVP conversation as well. But either way, Burrow's elite passing led to high-end fantasy production, even without the rushing production or ability of the 4 guys ahead of him on this list. And it's not like he's, Kirk Cousins back there is like a complete statue. He ran a little bit, over 200 rushing yards, couple rushing touchdowns, but the damage is definitely done with his arm for the most part. So yeah, we'll see if T. Higgins is back next season. It sounds like that's a priority for Burrow at least, but it's unfortunately not completely up to him. But that would certainly help his receiving weapon situation outside of Jamar Chase, because yeah, I don't think any of the other guys right now, Jermaine Burton, Andre Yoshivas, I don't think they really did enough to kind of earn that spot. I mean, Gesicki was a solid receiving touchdown, or tight end, but he's a pending free agent now as well. So yeah, hopefully they can get Higgins back or bring in another viable option there, because it can't all fall to Jamar Chase. But still hard not to believe Burrow can't keep it going regardless, just based on everything he just did in 2024. Okay, one more ad break here from our friends at DraftKings Pick 6. Have you played Pick 6 from DraftKings yet? What are you waiting for? You better get on it. The playoffs are here and time is running out. As the official daily fantasy sports partner of the NFL, DraftKings does fantasy sports like no one else. Play for better payouts on Pick 6. It's super easy to get started. Select 2 or more players. Choose if they'll have more or less of a stat like touchdowns, yardage, sacks, and more. Pick 6 is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. And DraftKings is making it even sweeter for first-timers. New Pick 6 customers play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits, win more cash on Pick 6. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits that expire in 30 days. Limited time offer. See terms at picksix.draftkings.com/promos. All right, let's turn our attention to the next tier, and another 3 quarterbacks who make up this group, and leading the group is the one and only Patrick Mahomes. For you, Nate, there aren't a lot of NFL rankings where he'd be outside the top 5, but for fantasy purposes, he's been kind of dropping to that range after a couple seasons of non-top 5 production. So this is really starting to feel like the more appropriate range for Mahomes compared to what he gave us during that 2022 QB1 overall season.
Yeah. First, in general, there's a pretty big gap between the second tier and the third tier, with the top 5 being quarterbacks who are fairly confident should be at least top 8 fantasy quarterbacks this year. After that, there's a lot of quarterbacks that you could argue belong in the top 10 fantasy quarterbacks. A lot of quarterbacks who seem to play well if the matchup was good enough, and then not well enough if the matchup was bad. So there's a lot of quarterbacks that you could consider in the top 10. These 3 quarterbacks in this tier are the ones that I'm kind of most confident should stay in the top 10 fantasy quarterbacks and at least can fight for one of those top 5 spots. And I think Mahomes has kind of the clear best chance of these 3 quarterbacks to get there. I was someone who was consistently getting at least 22 fantasy points per game earlier in his career when he had Tyreek Hill, and then he lost Tyreek Hill, and then the fantasy production just wasn't quite as there. In 2023, very limited wide receiver options. They kind of eased Rashee Rice into action throughout the entire year. But outside of that, it wasn't very great at wide receiver. And then even this year, they didn't have Rashee Rice after about week 4. Hollywood Brown was out for most of the season, just recently came back, and they've been easing him back into action. But they really haven't had the wide receiver options that they hoped for. And then over the second half of this year, he started to be a little bit more consistent of a fantasy quarterback, was finishing as a top 12 quarterback more often than not, which was great to see. So we started to see Mahomes get there as he started to trust his wide receivers a little bit more. Xavier Worthy having a better end to the season, so that was good to see. Next year, we expect him to, at the very least, have Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy as his top 2 wide receivers. So that'll probably be better than what we've seen at wide receiver the past couple seasons. So that'll be nice to see. And then I think part of it as well is the Chiefs just haven't needed Mahomes to put up a ton of fantasy production, but they do have a pretty tough schedule, at least on paper currently. They have to play 6 of the other 7 teams who had made the divisional round of the playoffs next year, and then also play the Broncos and Chargers twice, both teams that made the playoffs and seem to be getting better and have the cap space to improve this offseason. So the Chiefs ideally will have a tougher schedule this season, which will mean more close games, which will mean the Chiefs will need to rely on Mahomes to pass a bit more. So I think Mahomes definitely has a chance to get there as a top 5 fantasy quarterback, even though we just haven't quite seen it the past 2 years.
Yeah, like you said, it's not going to be impossible for him to bounce back to that range. He definitely has the talent, but like you said, it's kind of been this balanced enough offense and team as a whole where there's more that the team can do to win every week and not just rely on Mahomes's arm. But yeah, interestingly, like he dropped back a ton still, 41.3 dropbacks per game. That was the second highest rate in the league behind only Joe Burrow. But he's also throwing, like you said, to past his prime Travis Kelce, no Rashee Rice for most of the year, no Hollywood Brown for most of the year, rookie Xavier Worthy, 32-year-old DeAndre Hopkins. So yeah, I think there's a chance that Mahomes can be that top 5 guy again, but I think it'll take a lot of his kind of receivers maybe performing at an elite level again, and everyone kind of clicking to up his touchdown rate and even yardage a bit, because this past year tied for his lowest passing touchdown total as a starter, and it was his lowest yards per attempt mark at 6.8 as a starter as well, which ranked 27th among quarterbacks this year. So yeah, not to make excuses for Patrick Mahomes, because he doesn't need any help at all, but I think with a better receiving core, we should see more fantasy friendly Patrick Mahomes. I mean, yeah, he had I'm looking 11 of his 16 weekly finishes outside the top 12 scoring quarterbacks for the week. So wasn't really worth the investment that he was in drafts this past year, but there's always the chance that he can get back there because he's Patrick Mahomes, and I think the receiving core plays a big part in that as well. So yeah, will be interesting to see how he is fantasy wise in 2025. Okay, next up for you in the ranks is San Francisco 49ers quarterback Brock Purdy, who also didn't have the best season, but the 49ers were a team decimated by injuries to key players, including Brandon Ayuk, Trent Williams, Christian McCaffrey. So you're expecting a bounce back season here for Purdy in 2025, Nate.
Yeah, and even though it wasn't a great season for the 49ers, it was still a solid fantasy season by Purdy. He was one of 7 quarterbacks to finish in the top 12 in at least 60% of his games. So he was one of the better quarterbacks in terms of consistently being a fantasy starter. And that's what he was doing a year before. So in terms of consistency over the past 2 seasons, outside of these great rushing quarterbacks, in terms of pure passers, Purdy has been one of the most consistent fantasy quarterbacks. So I don't think his ceiling is quite as high as a lot of the other quarterbacks we've talked about, since this is still the 49ers, who will ideally be running the ball a lot because that's their philosophy on offense, and more shorter passes as well. But I think Purdy should have a fairly solid chance of being a top 10 fantasy quarterback. And like in terms of him specifically over the past 2 years, 82.4 passing grade, consistent over these past 2 seasons. It's 5th best for quarterbacks who are 26 or younger. We have a lot of quarterbacks in the league right now who we've talked about who are more like in the middle ages of a quarterback, who are right where we expect quarterbacks to be in their prime. But if you start looking at some of the younger quarterbacks that we expect to be improving, there aren't a lot of quarterbacks who are younger who have shown a lot in the NFL already, and Purdy is one of those few quarterbacks. So in terms of quarterbacks that we expect to be getting closer to their prime, Purdy is right up there in terms of those kind of quarterbacks.
Yeah, and like you said, the passing is still a strength for him. But like he did have some sneaky fantasy rushing ability this past year, because he increased his amount of carries per game. Like he went from 1.6 carries per game in 2023 to 3.9 in 2024. Like that was more than Patrick Mahomes, more than Baker Mayfield, more than CJ Stroud, among others. So you could argue that, he ran or scrambled more because he had to, and the passing options weren't there like in previous seasons, which is probably true, but still quite the difference from 2023. And he was pretty effective in doing so as a rusher, back-to-back seasons with 90 plus rushing grades as a runner, got up to 4.9 yards per carry this year, even had 5 rushing touchdowns, which was more than Lamar Jackson somehow. So if this 49ers team, like as a whole, is able to kind of bounce back in 2025, which they're certainly capable of, then I think we should expect Purdy to kind of be a big part of that, and a big beneficiary of it as well for fantasy purposes. Okay, rounding out this tier 3 for you, Nate, and coming in as QB8 is one of the top surprise performances for the position this past year. Bo Nix hit the ground running as a rookie, Nate, and you've got him back in that top 10 range where he finished this past season, so expecting more of the same from Nix in year 2.
Oh yeah, a lot of things to like about Knicks in terms of fantasy. 5th in rushing attempts, where the top 4 in rushing attempts were the 4 quarterbacks we talked about at the top of this show. So if Knicks continues to see a lot of rushing attempts, that certainly helps him. Was only 8th in rushing yards, so ideally he becomes a little bit more effective as a rusher while he's doing it. But played well as a passer for a rookie quarterback, especially considering the receivers they have in Denver and the skill players in general, but expect them to make some changes this offseason. They seem to be one of the top contenders to add a running back this offseason. Ideally, they upgrade at tight end as well. A chance they bring in a wide receiver, but also a chance that they stick with their young wide receivers. Marvin Mims seemed to be getting more involved over the course of the season. They have a bunch of other guys as well, Devon Bailey, Troy Franklin, who could step up too, along with Cortland Sutton, who's the number 1 wide receiver. So I think there's definitely room for the offense to improve, room for Nix to improve as a passer in his second season, a room for him to continue to evolve as a rusher. So I think Nix is one of those quarterbacks who probably has a bit more upside than Brock Purdy, but also has a lot of risk because we've only seen it for 1 season. And there could be changes in Denver. There could also not be changes in Denver. We could see a bit more of the same. Maybe they rely more on the run game than they did this year, in which case we might not see as much volume out of Nix. So I think he's a bit of a high risk, high reward option, but out of all the quarterbacks that we've only really seen about 1 year of sample size for, outside of Jaden Daniels, of course, I think Nix has the best odds of having a breakout season.
Yeah, I think it was just like a surprising year overall, but I think he really impressed. Really the jump in value for him from this past offseason, where he wasn't even being drafted among like the top 24 quarterbacks to finishing as a top 10 quarterback at his position, was the big surprise, even considering he had a ton of college experience relative to this draft class, relative to a lot of draft classes, to be honest. But part of it too was that at Oregon he was kind of this low A dot conservative type passer that didn't really feel likely to translate to fantasy. And then he kind of threw that stereotype out the window as a rookie, because even though he was closer to average in terms of average depth of target, like he dropped back at a top 10 rate per game. He made the most of his opportunities, threw for over 3,700 yards, and more importantly, threw for 29 touchdowns as well, which was the sixth most at the position. Then he added some of that rushing ability, showed a willingness to scramble, which led to 3.9 runs per game. That was a top 10 mark, if we're taking out QB Neals, by the way. So yeah, he definitely proved capable as a rookie. I wouldn't be surprised to see him, kind of hit again in year two. I wouldn't be surprised to see him miss in a little bit as well. Like you said, there's some risk to it heading into year two. Does he have that potential sophomore slump like we saw with CJ Stroud? There's always going to be that concern there, and kind of what they do this offseason around him. But yeah, I think he kind of earned his spot to be among this top 12, top 10 quarterbacks right now, considering his first year in the league.
And I think out of a lot of the quarterbacks we've talked about, he probably has some of the most movement to go up or down, depending on how this offseason goes. A lot of the teams we talked about are kind of established teams. We expect them to keep a lot of the same core, expect like the quarterbacks we just talked about, Kansas City, should keep the same top two wide receivers. The 49ers, yeah, we might see them trade one of their wide receivers or something like that, but expect them to have a lot of the same players, where Knicks, I think, has that variability of things could go really well this offseason. Things could kind of stay the same this offseason.
Nice. Okay, final tier for today. And again, you can check out the full list of Nate's early rankings and tiers for 2025 on pff.com for free right now. But we'll round out the top 12 for this show with the first four names in tier 4 for you, Nate, being led off by Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers. What's this fourth tier kind of about for you, and what's got Love kind of leading the way?
Yeah, the fourth tier is a fairly large tier where there's a lot of quarterbacks who generally have shown that they can be a fantasy starter in the right matchups, but haven't shown that kind of consistency. So I think there's going to be a big strategy this year of you're either going to draft one of those top 5 quarterbacks, or you're going to draft 2 of these other quarterbacks, and then just start whichever one has the better matchup. I think we'll see a lot of that, and we could see a lot of teams waiting on quarterbacks. So especially this tier, I could see people waiting longer than we've seen them wait in past years, because there are so many names that you can be comfortable with that you could get the 18th and 19th quarterback in terms of rankings and potentially be fine in terms of fantasy. So that's kind of where this tier is in general. The top couple players in the tier are generally younger quarterbacks who have shown that they have that elite upside, but haven't shown it consistently yet. And I think Jordan Love fits that pretty well. He was one of the top fantasy quarterbacks a year ago. To start this year, he was averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks. So was starting the season among the top fantasy quarterbacks, but at that point had suffered 2 different injuries. So I think injuries took their toll a little bit on Love, as well as injuries to Romeo Doubs. Christian Watson certainly didn't help. So Love did not have a great second half of the season, at least in terms of fantasy production. But in terms of those younger quarterbacks, 82.6 grade over the past 2 years. That's 4th best for quarterbacks who are 26 or younger. So as among the top quarterbacks in terms of how good they've been that are younger and could improve. Could also see this team adding at the wide receiver position this offseason. I was doing the rankings in general, and we'll get to wide receivers in an upcoming week, but none of the Packers wide receivers ended up making my rankings at all, which was the top 150 overall players, because you could kind of make an argument for any one of those wide receivers to be right on the borderline, but because they're all right there, it's hard to trust any of them in any given week. So until they make some changes at wide receiver or someone steps up, it's hard to trust any of those receivers. But it's still a young core of players who should ideally be improving, and hopefully Love bounces back from what we saw in the second half of this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of this ambiguous wide receiver group, right? Where all those guys kind of flashed wide receiver one for the team potential throughout the season, but nobody really did it consistently, right? So it could be a good thing for for Jordan Love because he has all those guys that are talented enough around him that they can kind of prop his passing production up a little bit. But it makes it trickier, yeah, for wide receiver positional rankings for sure. So yeah, this ranking for Love, it definitely says he's in for a bounce back in 2025. Doesn't necessarily have like any rushing upside, or at least he hasn't shown that yet in the NFL, but we know the passing upside is there. We saw that in 2023 when he was like QB5 overall. So kind of splitting the difference here, I think for 2025 is what I got from this ranking. Not quite to that elite level of his first year as a starter, but definitely better than what we got last year. And I can agree with that for sure.
Just thinking at the free agency a little bit, they seem primed to get like an Amari Cooper or DeAndre Hopkins, the kind of guys that got to Buffalo and Kansas City, haven't really done much for them, but having a veteran receiver to kind of help lead some of these younger receivers could also just be help for them and be a team where those wide receivers can go to and be more productive than they currently are with their offenses, but still have a chance to have success in the playoffs because the Packers seem to be right there, but just not quite as high as some of the other teams.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. Okay, Baker Mayfield is up next as QB10 for you, Nate. A career best QB4 finish in 2024. He's been thriving in Tampa. Definitely worth considering among this top 10 after 2 straight seasons now of sample size where he's been just that. So, what are your thoughts on Mayfield heading into 2025, Nate?
One of my things was concerns about what could happen with Tampa Bay in general, and we did get some breaking news this morning that Liam Cohen is back with Tampa Bay as offensive coordinator. Thought he'd be leaving for Jacksonville, but they got him to a new contract, so that was one of my concerns. That's out the window, so that might be enough to move Mayfield up to number 9 for me. But there's also concerns Mike Evans is not getting any younger. He is right at the age where we see most wide receivers basically no longer be in the NFL anymore. I think Adam Thielen's the only wide receiver who's a year older than Evans in the league. So there's that concern. Chris Godwin's a free agent, so there's that as well. And then in general, like we saw him do really well this past season, but probably talking about why I have him lower than where he was last season. It's also the consistency we've seen out of passing quarterbacks in the league over the past decade or so. All of the quarterbacks that we've seen have multiple seasons as quarterbacks to score at least 20 fantasy points are some of the top quarterbacks in the league. Of the top 16 quarterbacks by PFF pass grade over the last decade, 11 of them have had multiple seasons with 20 or more fantasy points without having that rushing upside. Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen are also up there, but they do have the rushing upside. It's only really been Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, and Carson Palmer over the past decade who haven't had multiple of those elite fantasy seasons. But we really haven't seen any quarterback who's not there have those multiple seasons with at least 20 fantasy points. Deshaun Watson is the only quarterback who's there, but he was very good and then hasn't been nearly as good these past few seasons. And he also had some of that rushing upside. So we haven't seen a quarterback like Mayfield have those multiple seasons with at least 20 fantasy points. So he seems bound to regress because of that. His PFF grade has been improving in recent seasons, so there's a chance that it takes another step forward, especially with Liam Cohen back. But I think it'll be interesting to see if they're able to get Chris Godwin on the team again. If he is, I could see a case for Mayfield jumping up a tier and being among those 6 to 8 range quarterbacks. But it'll be interesting to see how the offseason goes. But in general, today was big for him having Liam Cohen back because the offense made a huge leap with Cohen as offensive coordinator. And I thought they'd regress without him, but with him back, that does make a very big difference for the offense.
Yeah, I'm with you for sure. I think it's huge for him, and he was definitely one of the more interesting players for me. Like as far as where to rank him in 2025, and I think in an interesting spot here as well at the top of tier 4, with the other 3 names around him. Like I think 3 of the 4 guys that we're going to talk about here to round out this top 12, I think we could say kind of disappointed relative to expectations, but Baker is kind of the lone guy in here that exceeded expectations, even after that strong first year in Tampa in 2023, where finishing this year as a top 5 quarterback wasn't really anywhere near his expected outcome. So he delivers this big year again, doing so without Chris Godwin in the lineup for the latter half of the year, just slinging it out there this season, like 2 years in a row now, over 4,000 yards passing, top 10 in passing touchdowns both years as well, but was even better than his 2023 season, like you said, kind of improving a little bit as a passer. So I think he's earned the spot inside the top 10, and him kind of outperforming expectations again is always possible, especially with the news that Liam Cohen is staying on as offensive coordinator and not taking the Jacksonville head coaching gig. But either way, feels like we're at a point now where Mayfield's value is kind of settling into what he's kind of proven he can be over these past 2 years compared to where it was this past offseason, where he was being drafted a lot later, if at all, in fantasy drafts.
I think it'll also be interesting what if their defense is able to improve this offseason or not, because this could end up being a team that's more established among the elite in the NFC. If their defense is playing better, their run game really picked it up at the end of the season as well. They might not need Mayfield to throw as much as they have in recent seasons. If the defense is playing better, if they're not in as many shootout games, then that leads to fewer passing attempts, but there's also that possibility.
Yeah, they dealt with a ton of injuries at the defensive back position this year. So obviously that secondary was banged up, and nobody more important than Antoine Winfield Jr., who missed a ton of time because of injury, right? So yeah, it'll definitely be a group that can improve from what they did this year. And yeah, that could make a difference for sure. Okay, next up, a quarterback who has the potential, or at least we thought he did, to crack that kind of top tier, maybe top 5 at some point. But after a disappointing second season, which included losing his starting job for a stint, Anthony Richardson is now outside the top 10 for you, Nate, but not too far, since, as we know, the potential is there. It's just yet to be kind of unlocked.
Yeah, the big thing is rushing. He was third in rushing yards per game for quarterbacks, so he missed a couple games in there, so his totals weren't as high as some of these other quarterbacks, but he's right up there with some of these top rushers. He also doesn't have the rushing touchdowns, which ideally he would have more of those, but I think it'll be interesting to see if the Colts offense can improve another year. It looks like a lot of the players in place should still be there. Michael Pittman was dealing with back injuries all season, so hopefully Pittman is able to improve. Outside of that, it's a bunch of young wide receivers who have shown some potential so far, so a chance this offense in general gets better. So I think as long as he stays the starting quarterback, then he has the potential to be that top 5 player because he has the rushing production. Hopefully that passing improves a little bit, but there's also a risk that he doesn't keep the starting job, where I don't think any of the other quarterbacks we're talking about today have that risk of potentially losing their job due to poor play.
Yeah, that was definitely frustrating this past year for him, but he's definitely one of the more interesting names here too on this group. Like, undoubtedly talented with a monster arm. He's an athletic stud where, he can be that elite rushing threat. Like, this is a combination that you would think is worth betting on for both NFL teams and for fantasy. Like, obviously the price isn't going to be as high as it was last offseason. So just outside the top 10, I think makes the risk for Anthony Richardson a little bit more tolerable. I would hope that they could kind of really lock in on developing him this offseason as a passer specifically, and just commit to him as a starter, since they did spend a 3rd overall pick on him just 2 years ago, and his, or 4th overall, I think, and his rookie year was cut short due to injury. So it's still such a small sample size of him in the NFL to kind of judge him on. I know Steichen, I think it was, mentioned potentially bringing in some competition, which we'll see who that is. It's not exactly an overly intimidating free agent class where it'll be like an obvious starter over Richardson, but yeah, either way, it doesn't seem like they're going to give him the super long leash, which is still surprising to me that they were never, probably winning a Super Bowl with 50-year-old Joe Flacco. So maybe give the kid a confidence boost, let him play in 2025, let it play out however it does, and then kind of evaluate the position again next offseason, since they're not in a good enough position to maybe add a legit quarterback this offseason anyway. So why not commit to Richardson? I hope for 2025, and it could pay off for fantasy purposes as well.
Like you said, not a great free agent class, but I just had the thought of what if Justin Fields goes there, because Justin Fields is the one interesting quarterback name in free agency, specifically for fantasy football purposes. And it would kind of be amusing if the two quarterbacks who had all that rushing upside ended up having to compete for the same starting job.
Oh man, that would be nuts. Yeah, that's that'll be interesting for sure. I don't know, man. I think just commit to Richardson at this, like they spent so high of a draft capital to get him. Like, how do you not just give him one more year? And why even, shake him up like confidence wise with adding like a Justin Fields in there for this year? If you have to address the position next year, but this year I think use it as a development year for Richardson and see if he's really going to be your starter. But I don't know. That's just me. All right. Finally, QB12 is CJ Stroud, who had a lot of hype coming out of his rookie year. He won Offensive Rookie of the Year. He was top 10 in passing yards, had like this great touchdown to interception ratio. He took the Texans to the playoffs as a rookie, but didn't quite live up to those expectations in year two. Houston still made the playoffs, even won a game, but Stroud just 15th in passing yards this past year through 12 interceptions compared to 20 touchdowns, and finished as QB 18 in fantasy. So Nate, do you think we get a bounce back season for Stroud in 2025?
I think so. I think we already started to see it a little bit at the end of this season. First off, he has never been able to keep his wide receivers healthy. In his rookie season, it was like one wide receiver was injured 1 week, then 2 weeks later it was a different receiver, then 2 weeks later it was a different one. This year it was just a more consistent. Stephon Diggs was out for the season by the middle of the season, and then Tank Dell also injured and potentially missing a decent amount of time next year. But hopefully he can have at least a top 2 wide receivers. I could very well see Stephon Diggs coming back to Houston next year after that strong start this year. But in terms of like PFF grade, since week 13 or so, he started to more consistently have at least a 75 passing grade. We saw it in the playoffs as well, where the offensive line had its struggles early in the season. They started to get a little bit better. Ideally, they continue to make more improvements on the offensive line. But just similar to what I was saying with Brock Purdy and Jordan Love, there just aren't a lot of young quarterbacks in the league who have shown on any kind of sample size the potential to be one of the better passers in the league. And I think Stroud is one of those quarterbacks that we have seen it at times. It just hasn't been consistently over the course of these last 2 seasons, but we've seen those kind of flashes where he can be one of the better passers in the league. So I think in terms of all of the quarterbacks that you could be considering, I'm generally preferring the quarterbacks that have shown at least some sample of playing time, but are still young enough that we can also see improvement compared to what we've seen before.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And I mean, I think part of it too is just avoiding sacks. Like he was getting killed back there. I think he took the second most sacks on the year or something like that, behind only Caleb Williams. He had a high pressure to sack conversion rate as well. Like, so a lot of that is on him. And hopefully all his wide receivers are healthy for 2025. Like you said, though, Tank Dell feels unlikely at this point, even just having but even just having Nico Collins for a full year, I think is going to be a key. We'll see if Stephon Diggs comes back, because I think it'll definitely help him to have that at least second receiving option that he could rely on consistently. I think Dalton Schultz is a fine tight end, but maybe not a legit second receiving option. That they tried out Deontay Johnson. John Mechie doesn't feel like he's breaking out, it seems. Robert Woods was 33 years old, something like that at this point. So they got to add somebody in there. Maybe it's Stephon Diggs, maybe it's another piece in the draft or something like that. But getting some help to that wide receiver core, having them healthy makes a big difference as well. So that's kind of the top 12, Nate. Like I said, there's the full list of QB tiers and rankings that you put together up on the website right now for free. Should we mention the final names in tier 4? We don't need to really talk too much about them, but
I can go through them. Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Caleb Williams, Tua Tagovailoa, and Sam Darnold, all quarterbacks who were top 10 either at times throughout this season or top 10 in other recent seasons, and reason enough for them to bounce back. So just a lot of options at quarterback that you can see a case for them being top 10. All they need is a little bit to go right or a little bit to go wrong to be outside of the top 10. But even beyond that, there are quarterbacks in tier 5, which I won't mention, and let you go to the article and find those quarterbacks that you could make a strong case for them to be in that top 10 discussion or so. There's only a couple of teams really out there that don't have a quarterback option that hopefully in free agency or the draft, they're able to find at least someone to help their team for this year, but maybe not big fantasy options. And especially this rookie class I'll mention as well. We'll go into rookies plenty over the course of the offseason. But in general, even though we saw this great group of rookie quarterbacks this year, at least from what I've seen so far, I'm not expecting that strong of a class this year, especially the quarterbacks that we tend to see break out as rookies in terms of fantasy production, get a lot of that on the ground. And the quarterbacks who have a chance to be starters in the rookie season don't seem to be the best rushing quarterbacks in the world. So I'm not going to be ranking the rookie quarterbacks over or too high at the moment, especially because that they're drafted early as well. That'll be to teams that aren't in the best environment to have a fantasy starting quarterback.
Yep. Makes perfect sense. All right, that is going to do it for us this week. Thank you all again for tuning in. Like I said last week, it's the fantasy season's over and all that, but we enjoy doing these early rankings and get a little bit of a head start on preparations for the 2025 season. So Nate, thank you for getting that early start on the 2025 season. And you dropped your quarterback tiers on PFF.com this week. What's the next position down the pipe for you?
I think I'll go with tight ends next week, and then we'll close out with wide receivers the week after, and probably not do kickers and defense quite yet, even though I was among Fantasy Pros most accurate kicker and defense ranker this year. But I'll try to write more about kickers and defense between now and September, just maybe not in January.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think we can wait on kickers and defenses, but looking forward to the tight ends next week, and then we will close it out with wide receivers after that. So thank you all again. See you all next week. Enjoy the conference championship round, and until next time, peace out.